Christy Schreiber, and we're here to discuss books that have changed the world and have changed us.
And I'm Gary Schreiber, and this is the How to Love It podcast. This is our third and final episode discussing Michael Crichton's blockbuster novel turned movie, Jurassic Park. In episode 1, we introduced Crichton himself, gave a little background on his career, and set up the book through the first iteration, giving a few hints as to the themes and the motifs to be looking for as we read the book. Now, Christy, having only seen the movie, I was shocked at how serious of a book this is. In episode 2, we talked through iteration 5 of the book, sort of, and we didn't focus on plot points almost at all, but instead on fractals, if you can believe it, and chaos theory and nonlinear equations and topics that don't usually come up in a literary podcast.
No, I'd say they don't.
All of which are mathematical applications to real life that completely baffle most because they are so often expressed in the abstract. But Crichton, using literary techniques such as setting and plot and dialogue, things we understand, he explains in everyday words and he explains these beautiful pictures of dinosaurs and what these terms mean and how chaos theory and complicated patterns affect our everyday lives. And this is our third and final episode where we discuss iterations 6 and 7 and 3 important symbols: the raptors, the migrating birds, and then the feminine. Christy, am I assuming that there's something archetypal in all these dinosaurs being female?
Well, you can assume that I'm going to argue that. I mean, Michael Crichton is writing about science. He's writing about math. He's writing about politics. But today we're going to discuss how he is writing about philosophy. The book is a fractal.
Oh,
I mean, that's not to say it isn't an adventure story, because it is, for sure. It's fun, for sure. But there is something that rings true and even eternal. And although Crichton's political interests may be dated, although I know you might say that's arguable, the ideas behind the politics and behind the social, those are not dated. But before we jump into that, I do want to reiterate what it means when we say something is rhetorical, because we've been saying that over and over and over again. Crichton's rhetorical, Crichton's rhetorical. Well, when we say that, what we mean is he's deliberately trying to persuade us of something. And we call that making a claim. Crichton is making claims. But when we think about claims, we think of them in 3 big ways. We say somebody might be trying to make us believe that something is true that we don't already think is true. And when they're doing that, we say that they're making a claim of fact. Now, here's one. If I'm claiming that dinosaurs are warm-blooded and you think they're cold-blooded, and I'm going to show you proof that they're warm-blooded, that would be an example of a claim of fact. But there are other kinds of claim. Sometimes someone is trying to persuade us that something is important and we dismiss it. And we call that making a claim of value. For example, if I'm going to argue that we don't need to create dinosaurs, or we shouldn't be making life at all out of test tubes because that's immoral, then I'm going to be making a claim of value. But finally, we have what we call claims of policy. And that means that I want you to do something. For example, if I think scientists should be forced by law to publish their findings publicly, whether or not they receive public funding, then I'm wanting people to do something. I want people to change a behavior. Well, Crichton makes all 3 kinds of claims in the story. He wants us to believe things that we don't already believe. He wants to value things that we don't already think are important. And he wants us to change behaviors in specific ways, political ways. So let's talk about what these claims are and how he's making them. And of course, how can we do that, but not to go back to the wise voice of wisdom of Dr. Ian Malcolm.
I love how Malcolm is always spouting wisdom like an ancient philosopher or religious figure, but he's this rock star styled mathematician. How many of those have you seen in real life?
I know. And this is just Crichton, I'm sure, making a bit of fun. But Malcolm does spout all of his wisdom. And at this point, He's in this place of delirium. I mean, he's slowly bleeding to death. He's on this island that he claims was doomed to destruction, but he still managed to want to visit for a weekend. I mean, even Malcolm is a man of contradictions. So, Gary, let's go back to iteration 5 and let's read what Malcolm says about the nature of life. Because the ideas that he says, they kind of sound strange and they sound counterintuitive when we hear them. But of course, the more we think about them, the more we find ourselves agreeing with the doctor.
Living systems are never in equilibrium. They are inherently unstable. They may seem stable, but they are not. Everything is moving and changing. In some sense, everything is on the edge of collapse. I'm skipping the other characters' lines, but Gennaro says that temperature is stable, to which Malcolm's going to respond, body temperature changes constantly. It changes cyclically over 24 hours, lowest in the morning, highest in the afternoon. It changes with mood, with disease, with exercise, with outside temperature, with food. It continuously fluctuates up and down, tiny jiggles on a graph, because at any moment, some forces are pushing temperature up, other forces are pulling it down. It is inherently unstable, and every other aspect of living systems is like that too.
So here we go, stumbling on a question, and this isn't a new question. I mean, man has struggled with this since the earliest societies on our planet. What the heck is the nature of life? What makes something alive? I mean, that's what he's talking about. He's saying it's unstable, and you can assume that the other characters think it's stable. But I'm not sure, as humans, we have agreed on the definition of life.
You know, in its most practical sense, most of us will tell you, I know it when I see it, you know. And right, we certainly know when something is dead. Of course, this is an area where science starts to merge with philosophy and religion in very obvious ways. But let's just look at the science side of things. And I dug up this old edition of Scientific American dated from 1937, where a scientist did just that. He defined life, and this is how he defined it. Living matter can grow, reproduce itself, make internal adaptations to its environment, maintain itself by taking in food, building up and tearing down tissues, metabolism, and excreting waste matter, replace its damaged parts, and hand down certain characteristics in a hereditary way to its offspring.
Well, to me, that's pretty easy to understand, and in some ways explains why Dr. Wu in the 6th edition, as the dinosaurs are tearing through the skylights and trying to kill them, is kind of excited when he finds out that the dinosaurs are breeding. And let's read his thoughts.
And though Wu would never admit it, the discovery that the dinosaurs were breeding represented a tremendous validation of his work. A breeding animal was demonstrably effective in a fundamental way. It implied that Wu had put all the pieces together correctly. He had recreated an animal millions of years old with such precision that the creature could even reproduce itself. But still, looking at the raptors outside, he was troubled by the persistence of their behavior. Raptors were intelligent, and intelligent animals got bored quickly. Intelligent animals formed plans and...
Dun, 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 dun. You know, so basically, Wu is excited because according to this basic definition of life that you just read, he created life in a lab from something that was previously not alive. He's God. God creates man. Wu creates man. Wu is now God.
Yes, although if you keep reading, we find out he's not quite God in the sense of being immortal or omnipotent, but, you know, that might be a spoiler. But and I know you want to revisit what these raptors represent symbolically, but if we just want to talk about this basic definition of life, the definition itself is very complicated. And modern science asks us lots of questions that we can't easily answer. You know, of course, many of us can remember from grade school being confused about viruses when we were told they were living but not living. And
I remember.
Yeah, but there are other issues as well, and they affect a lot of even our political discourse. For example, is there life on other planets? And when does life begin? And what value should we place on things that are living or non-living? And are living things inherently more valuable because they're alive? Are some living things more valuable than other living things? For example, should we honor weeds and insects and mosquitoes the same way we honor cute dogs or people? Or what about people? Are all people of equal value? And if so, what's the criteria for that? I mean, there are many directions this conversation could go, and they all have deep moral and ethical and religious implications. And, later on in the 1950s, scientists developed more understanding of DNA. I mean, the existence of genetic information or a genetic code seemed to be able to give us a more precise definition of life. And Watson and Crick famously described, in 1953, they described DNA as a twisted ladder or a double helix. And ever since, we have associated that diagram with life. And, DNA is not a life form, but it is the genetic material of a life form.
Well, I want to take issue with that in part.
Oh, so is the English teacher going to challenge DNA?
No, not DNA, but the discovery of the double helix. I mean, literature teachers or even art teachers for years have been seeing and commenting on this double helix pattern because it shows up in all kinds of ancient mythology. I mean, the first archetypal motif I want to talk about is this idea that Crichton made all these dinosaurs female, and he references this over and over again. Now, at some level, of course, that's a plot point. It's a function of plot, and it makes part of the story. They think they're containing the island by making the dinosaurs female, but there is also an archetypal understanding about the feminine, and it comes up a lot in literature. Feminine, archetypally, is associated with chaos.
Well, I guess I can certainly see that in our house.
Aren't you cute? I can be chaotic, but that's beside the point. It's interesting, and I want to reference an old Mesopotamian myth from 2300 BC, the ancient goddess Tiamat. Now, Tiamat, if you know your Mesopotamian goddesses.
Oh, we're all up on that.
She's the mother of all gods. Now, isn't this interesting? She births all of them. She's primordial, and get this. She is depicted in Mesopotamian art as a female serpent or a dragon. Now, is that a dinosaur, a female dinosaur, or what? The mother of all the gods is, in Mesopotamian mythology, a female dragon.
Okay, so that's interesting. So what are you saying? I mean, do you think Crichton went to an old ancient story for this Jurassic Park idea? And if so, why? I mean, I don't see your point yet.
No, I don't really think Crichton is recreating a mythological legend, although I do think he likely knew about and may have intentionally used commonly known archetypes. But sometimes the reason a story strikes a chord is because under its surface, it hits on something. It hits on something about life that we think is true, but we don't know how to explain well with words. And so if you ever hit on a story, if you write a story that's speaking to truth, it's going to be successful. But here's the idea that I think connects with this story, and Malcolm is saying, and I think it's what Crichton might be expressing. But to do that, let me go back to my myth story. So in the old legend, we have this water goddess, the dragon, and she represents chaos. She mates with a male god named Apsu, and from out of them, life is created. Out of this instability comes life. Exactly what Malcolm is talking about in the story. I want to point out, this wasn't pointed out to me, but if you look it up, you'll notice that it's right, that in all these ancient art pieces of Tiamat and Apsu that are literally 2,000 years old, they are drawn to look like a double helix. They look like DNA. Now, isn't that something? 2,000-year-old Mesopotamian artists are depicting DNA work in art that's supposed to represent the creation of life.
Oh, well, that's amazing. But, they could not have known about DNA.
Well, first of all, we don't know what these people did and didn't know. I'm of the opinion that they were probably more brilliant than we think they were. But, I don't think they really knew about DNA. But I do think they were trying to express something about the balance in life, something about chaos and order. And I do think that they clearly understood and saw life as unstable. And this is one of Crichton's claims of facts. He's claiming that life is not something we can control. There is an element of chaos absolutely inherent in this primordial existence, this nature of life that goes deep. It's in the very DNA of life itself, and it is to our peril not to respect it, which is something we aren't really taught. I mean, if you just Google the nature of nature or the nature of the natural world, which I did out of curiosity when I was prepping for this podcast, what came up is a bunch of articles about global warming, about environmental preservation. All these are good things. I'm not saying that they're not, but it makes nature look fragile. It also makes nature look like something we control, which is not what Crichton is saying. In fact, he's saying the opposite. Crichton is saying nature is aggressive. Nature is out to get us. Nature is not our friend. Nature, in many ways, is coming for us.
And that's why we like the movie. We know that, be it earthquakes or tornadoes or cancer or even age. I mean, nature is coming for us and nature will win. I love the idea that you said it's aggressive because nature is very aggressive. And so the raptors represent the aggressive, chaotic side of life, which is an ancient archetype, has traditionally been represented by the feminine, as you pointed out. The dinosaurs, and specifically the raptors, represent this chaotic life force, or this chaotic nature.
Yes, and notice that the raptors are intelligent. They're self-organizing, but their most defining characteristic is that they're coming. Man in this story is not taming these raptors, which is an interesting deviation from the traditional adventure story that we usually expect to see. In Jurassic Park, nature clearly wins. I mean, in almost every other adventure story, man wins. I mean, man will slay the dragon, man will overcome the storm, man will tame the environment. But in Crichton's story, man must run for his life, and the dinosaurs win, which, of course, is why there can be sequel upon sequel until the money runs out. But let's read what Malcolm says about life. This comes from the beginning of the 7th iteration. In this section, he and Hammond are talking, and Hammond is worried that the animals will get out, and he's worried that they're going to destroy the planet. And Malcolm responds to this.
"You egomaniacal idiot," Malcolm said in fury. "Do you have any idea what you were talking about? You think you can destroy the planet? My, what intoxicating power you must have." Malcolm sank back on the bed. "You can't destroy this planet. You can't even come close."
"Most people believe," Hammond said stiffly, "that the planet is in jeopardy."
"Well, it's not," Malcolm said.
"All the experts agree that our planet is in trouble."
Malcolm sighed. "Let me tell you about our planet," he said. "Our planet is 4.5 billion years old. There has been life on this planet for nearly that long, 3.8 billion years. The first bacteria, and later the first multicellular animals, then the first complex creatures in the sea, on the land, then the great sweeping ages of animals, the amphibians, the dinosaurs, the mammals, each lasting millions upon millions of years. Great dynasties of creatures are rising, flourishing, dying away. All this happening against a background of continuous and violent upheaval. Mountain ranges thrust up and eroded away. Cometary impacts, volcanic eruptions, oceans rising and falling, whole continents moving. Endless, constant, and violent change. Even today, the greatest geographical feature on the planet comes from two great continents colliding, buckling to make the Himalayan mountain range over millions of years. The planet has survived everything. In its time, it will certainly survive us."
Hammond frowned. "Well, just because it lasted a long time," he said, "doesn't mean it's permanent. I mean, there's always a radiation accident."
"Suppose there was," Malcolm said. "Let's say we had a bad one, and all the plants and animals died, and the earth was clicking hot for 100,000 years. Life would survive somewhere, under the soil, or perhaps frozen in Arctic ice, And after all those years, when the planet was no longer inhospitable, life would again spread over the planet. The evolutionary process would begin again. It might take a few billion years for life to regain its present variety. And of course, it would be very different from what it is now. But the Earth would survive our folly. Life would survive our folly. Only we, Malcolm said, think that it wouldn't.
Hammond said, well, if the ozone layer gets thinner, there will be more ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface. So what? Well, it'll cause skin cancer.
Malcolm shook his head. Ultraviolet radiation is good for life. It's powerful energy. It promotes mutation and change. Many forms of life will thrive with more UV radiation.
And many others will die out, Hammond said.
Malcolm sighed. You think this is the first time such a thing has happened? Don't you know about oxygen?
I know it's necessary for life.
It is now, Malcolm said. But oxygen is actually a metabolic poison. It's a corrosive gas like fluorine, which is used to etch glass. And when oxygen was first produced as a waste product by certain plant cells, say around 3 billion years ago, it created a crisis for all other life on our planet. Those plant cells were polluting the environment with a deadly poison. They were exhaling a lethal gas and building up its concentration. A planet like Venus has less than 1% oxygen. On Earth, the concentration of oxygen was going up rapidly, 5, 10, eventually 21%. Earth had an atmosphere of pure poison, incompatible with life.
Hammond looked irritated. So what's your point? That modern pollutants will be incorporated too?
No, Malcolm said. My point is that life on Earth can take care of itself. In the thinking of a human being, 100 years is a long time. 100 years ago, we didn't have cars and airplanes and computers and vaccines. It was a whole different world. But to the Earth, 100 years is nothing. 1,000,000 years is nothing. This planet lives and breathes on a much vaster scale. We can't imagine its slow and powerful rhythms, and we haven't got the humility to try. We've been residents here for the blink of an eye. If we are gone tomorrow, the Earth will not miss us. So I'm going to skip on down the last line. He says this. Let's be clear. The planet is not in jeopardy. We are in jeopardy. We haven't got the power to destroy the planet or to save it, but we might have the power to save ourselves.
Okay, so the claim of value is not that we are in danger of killing nature. If we don't respect nature, nature is in danger of killing us. Isn't that interesting? Pollution, atomic war, all the things we're doing to the planet. At one point, this wild, feminine, destructive side of Mother Nature will just kick us off her planet. That is what Malcolm is saying. And that's a reversal of how we think of things. But as I was trying to point out with the old Mesopotamian myth, it's an old idea, not a new one. Crichton is just saying it in a new way.
So is Crichton wanting us to do something?
Which brings us to the claims of policies, right? What does Crichton want us to do about all of this? And as you might expect, who would we look to other than Malcolm, our wise mentor?
Of course.
I mean, we talked in episode 2 about how many times the word control comes up. At Jurassic Park, Hammond and his scientists think they have controlled nature. And of course, one cannot control the eternal, female, chaotic, life-giving force of the universe. Malcolm rants about that, and we just discussed it. But what is his claim of policy? Ultimately, Crichton is going to land on the idea that science is man's attempt at control, it's man's arrogance, it's man's drive for power. We believe that if we can do something, then we should do something. If science allows it, then it's permissible. He's going to argue that's wrong, that sometimes we shouldn't. And saying that we should only do something because we can is faulty reasoning. That thinking leads to doom because we should ask the question if we should do something. Let's read what he says, and then we'll discuss that as our final idea.
All this attempt to control, we are talking about Western attitudes that are 500 years old. They began at the time when Florence, Italy, was the most important city in the world. The basic idea of science, that there was a new way to look at reality, that it was objective, that it did not depend on your beliefs or your nationality, that it was rational, that idea was fresh and exciting back then. It offered promise and hope for the future, and it swept away the old medieval system, which was hundreds of years old. The medieval world of feudalite politics and religious dogma and hateful superstitions fell before science. But, in truth, this was because the medieval world didn't really work anymore. It didn't work economically, it didn't work intellectually, and it didn't fit the new world that was emerging. Malcolm coughed. But now, he continued, science is the belief system that is hundreds of years old. And like the medieval system before it, science is starting not to fit the world anymore. Science has attained so much power that its practical limits began to be apparent. Largely through science, billions of us live in one small world, densely packed and intercommunicating. But science cannot help us to decide what to do with that world or how to live. Science can make a nuclear reactor, but it cannot tell us not to build it. Science can make pesticide, but it cannot tell us not to use it. And our world starts to seem polluted in fundamental ways, air and water and land, because of ungovernable science, he sighed. This much is obvious to everyone. At the same time, the great intellectual justification of science has vanished. Ever since Newton and Descartes, science has explicitly offered us a vision of total control. Science has claimed the power to eventually control everything through its understanding of natural laws. But in the 20th century, that claim has been shattered beyond repair. First, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle set limits on what we could know about the subatomic world. Oh, well, we say, none of us lives in a subatomic world. It doesn't make any practical difference as we go through our lives. Then Gödel's theorem set similar limits to mathematics, the formal language of science. Mathematicians used to think that their language had some special inherent trueness that derived from the laws of logic. Now we know that what we call reason is just an arbitrary game. It's not special in the way we thought it was. And now chaos theory proves that unpredictability is built into our daily lives. It is as mundane as the rainstorm we cannot predict. And so the grand vision of science, hundreds of years old, the dream of total control, has died in our century. And with it, much of the justification, the rationale for science to do what it does, and for us to listen to it. Science has always said that it may not know everything now, but it will know eventually. But now we see that isn't true. It's an idle boast, as foolish and as misguided as the child who jumps off a building because he believes he can fly. We are witnessing the end of the scientific era. Science, like other outmoded systems, is destroying itself. As it gains in power, it proves itself incapable of handling the power because things are going very fast now. 50 years ago, everyone was gaga over the atomic bomb. That was power. No one could imagine anything more. Yet a bare decade after the bomb, we begin to have genetic power. And genetic power is far more potent than atomic power. And it will be in everyone's hands. It will be in kits for backyard gardeners, experiments for school children, cheap labs for terrorists and dictators. And that will force everyone to ask the same question, what should I do with my power? Which is the very question science says it cannot answer.
What should I do with my power? Isn't that an interesting question? And he claims that science cannot answer that question. Ethics and morality cannot be found in science. And so, if that's true, how can we possibly claim that science should not be questioned? That scientists, by being scientists, are virtuous? That following the science always leads to finding truth? Maybe it does, but what's more likely is that it leads to more questions.
These claims of policy are really open-ended. And, he puts forth a question but does not give an answer. I mean, what should we do? And it seems to me his first point, we shouldn't politicize, monetize, or we shouldn't oversimplify the problem.
Exactly. The first thing we should do is acknowledge that indeed it is a complicated problem. Different perspectives can and should be acknowledged and considered without condemning one as being bad or another as being good. The movie ends with Grant, Sattler, and a few others leaving the island on a helicopter, literally escaping the chaos. But the book does not end quite the same way. In the book, Grant, Sattler, and Gennaro have discovered raptors breeding, nesting, and organizing. The raptors are organized around a matriarchal pecking order in what is described as military formation. But what Grant finally understands is that these raptors, these birds of prey that represent this destructive force of nature, are migrating.
Migrating. Wow, what a bizarre way to end a book. These are the animals that literally tried to kill them, and now they are staring in fascination, and the scene is not horrific at all. It's beautiful, it's orderly, and it's natural.
Exactly. That's what I thought, too. What a bizarre way to end the book. Birds, I thought about them like this. They're archetypes. They've been used as symbols, since Bible times. The story of Noah's Ark has birds. There's birds in the Odyssey. We see To Kill a Mockingbird, the raven, and Edgar Allan Poe. There's so many birds as symbols. But what about migrating birds? What is the symbolism behind migrating birds? What are we talking about? Well, most of the time, when we see migrating birds, we're talking about the inevitability of change, the cycle inherent in life itself. And isn't that what these birds are doing? But in this case, right after Grant discovers the migrating birds, big helicopters, we can think of them as, man-made birds, I guess.
Continue the theme.
They fly in and they pick up our characters. And the Costa Rican government is going to just blow up the island. They want to get the remaining people off so they can just eliminate it. The government is coming in because the government can take control. An offer comes up to Grant and asks him, "Are you in charge?" And I'm going to quote the book here. And Grant says, "No." The officer looks at Gennaro and he says, "Are you in charge?" Gennaro answers, "No." I find this funny. The officer looks at Sattler, but then he won't even ask her if she's in charge. He'll circle back to Grant and says, "Please, senor, who is in charge?" In other words, who's in control? And Grant says, "Nobody." And that's the final word of dialogue until we jump into the epilogue.
And so that's Crichton's answer. Understand that you are not in charge.
I think it's something like that. And if I were to say what I think his final claim of policy might be, I think it would be something like this. We do need to do something. We need to protect our world as we know it. We need to preserve that which God has entrusted in our care. But that first action, whatever it is, which he will not say, I see no inherent claim of policy in that way. But whatever that first action is, it should come from a place of humility. Because it is in humility that we find our best hope for survival.
It's an interesting warning. It's an awesome book. It's a great message. It was great to talk about. So thank you all for listening. We hope you've enjoyed our discussion over this final section of Jurassic Park. It went way deep in many directions. If you enjoyed this series, please reach out to us. You can find us on our social media, on our YouTube channel, on our website, howtoloveitpodcast.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe, leave us a comment, a review, a book recommendation. Most importantly, share an episode with a friend. It's when you share that we grow. Thank you once again for supporting us in our mission to make reading great literature accessible and enjoyable to as many people as possible.
Peace out.